we're gonna start with Josue, and just tell us how this passage in the sermon was an encouragement to you.
Even though the chapter talks about suffering all over, I saw it more real. For me, even though it's obvious, I saw it as a real thing, like not a joke. Like we do suffer as believers, and we're called to do that. It's not a joke. Like he emphasized that a lot, but it's worth it. So it's very simple, but it is the point, I think, of the lesson.
Let's go this way.
Yeah. So I was encouraged by just what you had to say about verse 18. It's probably one of the verses that moves me the most in the Bible, just the clarity of what the cross did, followed by one of the most perplexing verses in the Bible. But yeah, I was just ministered to by verse 18.
Yep.
Yeah, I was encouraged by just your second section, the suffering that has no fear of man, and just appreciated that exhortation to us as believers, as well as the blessing, the reminded blessing that we have. So yeah, specifically 13 and 14.
Michael?
I was particularly helped by your last sentence. Fear God, don't fear man, look to the cross. It just had just as a listener, it just had the effect of taking everything that you had said and summing it up and just kind of driving it down into my heart.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what a good conclusion should do. I know I'm doing answering other questions too at the same time. But the reason was it really ministered to me in that moment. So thank you.
Yeah, I was employing Peter, so chapter 5 was for you, how the apostles endured their suffering with joy. It's an encouragement to look not horizontally, but actually entrust yourself to God. Thank you for that.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think the most encouraging thing to me was this idea that kind of it was very clear that if I'm doing your first homiletical point, looking at the Lord, then I'm not just like also called to not fear man, but it was very evident that if I do that, then I'm not going to fear man. Right? So I was like, oh yeah, great. It was an encouragement.
Yeah, the whole idea was suffering, so I enjoyed and was personally encouraged by how you kind of changed your outlook on it. You said, don't waste it, because it's a privilege and it will change. It will become maturity. So it was encouraging how you were able to show that suffering isn't just something bad.
Yeah, I was encouraged and like the illustration of first comparing suffering to time, just as we don't want to waste time, don't want to waste our suffering. So how do you do that? By giving direction to your suffering. And that's our heart and our attitude, and how do we respond to suffering. That was encouraging.
Yeah, I was encouraged because while explaining a difficult passage, you helped me with not overreacting to suffering. Like, it almost normalizes it. I don't mean to use it in that way, but just knowing that there is a way in which suffering should happen is an encouragement, because it's an inevitable reality. So thank you for encouraging me in that regard. Thank you. What would you say you fell short of what you were trying to do?
In your first attempt.
What I was trying to do, I really struggled with the scripture. It was really hard to find. I spent the most of my time figuring out the scripture. but I couldn't fit really. I was afraid of fitting verse 19, so kind of jumping, you know, like. And I also, I don't know if also good enough. I wanted to use the tools that we have, not to go to any resource. So I didn't like follow any commentary or listen to sermons or anything, or positions or anything. I just wanted to take it like that. So it was really hard, like not much to restore. So I didn't know how to feel that part. I would say
Okay.
that.
Well, let me add this on for you. Encouragement. Like we had this happen before. You can use commentaries when you're preaching, although I like that the tools of exposition you use exclusively, but you can use them to help.
Okay.
Yep.
There's no
So-
harm in doing that.
So I either missed it, but I don't think, did you state a main point? Well, the point is, if you did, I missed it, and I didn't get a sense that you circled back to it
Right.
throughout. So I was like, these are like good little nuggets, but I didn't see the string on which the whole thing hung. So that's your most important sentence, I'd rather you say it 30 times than say it once and miss it.
Yeah.
Just to add on to that, maybe in a different perspective, it felt like you were explaining each section as opposed to arguing something to us.
Right,
There was, other than explaining the text and letting the text say what it has to say, there was no persuasive goal I felt that you were trying to get us to, other than maybe don't waste your suffering. Yeah. That's one area I felt a little confused by.
Thank you.
So I could tell that you were struggling with structure. This is a tough passage. Structure is tough, and to look for a way to unify it. And you went with that directional, upward and horizontal. And one of the things that happened for me, especially it happened first in that first section, was your decision to go with that directional imagery of looking upward. In one sense, seemed to be the opposite of what the text was saying, which is that the Lord is looking downward on us. And so I.
Going last is rough in here, man.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think you want to do is make sure that you're trying to, match the homiletical language that you're using with what's in the text as much as possible, because that was a moment where the text was kind of working against you, even as you were trying to make what I take to be a very good point. But the very directional language of the text was the opposite of what you were saying.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I thought you lost me a little bit when you began in verse 10, 12 and verse 1. And then went back to 9, 18, 9, the early bit. So what I mean is I lost what those sections were doing together. I thought you spoke about Psalm 34 well. But I wasn't too sure what your strategy was to start with that and then I got confused. It would have been helpful, even if you do that, to just say why you're starting here.
Yep. So I thought that at multiple points there were good theological statements being said out loud in public. However, I was rarely sure of why you were saying them. And even kind of like, okay, I think it probably has something to do with this text, but since it wasn't like firmly grounded because there were so many of them, it just felt like you were like, oh, by the way, and this doctrine and like this doctrine, and none of them were bad. It was just like, okay, they felt really disjointed, and because there's so many of them, it was kind of overwhelming.
Mm. But which ones? If you remember.
Especially like in your third point, you were throwing out all kinds of
Oh,
stuff.
yeah.
I don't know. I don't even remember what it was.
Okay.
There's too many of them to write down.
So, I mean, just kind of along the same lines, I think the whole beginning section with the sermon title, the main point, and the introduction to your points, you said them quick. You said them like once until you, because like even going through the points, I put vertical suffering there, and I was like, what does he mean by this? Which I think you may have said it, but I really understood it when you repeated it when you were talking about horizontal suffering. So just make sure once you are focusing on that point to explain them well.
Yeah, obviously this is about suffering and responding to suffering, and so if you're talking about fearing the Lord and not fearing man, which is good. That's going to lead to like how we respond in our attitude. And with that, I feel like really highlighting verse 15 was missed because it says, "In your hearts honor Christ as Lord," and so bringing that back to that first point of that direction.
Yeah.
A move to really kind of put just a little bit more meat to what you were saying there.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So for me, your cross-referencing work was a distraction. What I mean when I say that is when you go outside of your text, the longer you're out there, the more I'm waiting, or I either get lost in James or Psalms or Acts. You even said, let's turn. Be careful with that because it can be a real big distraction. You can lose somebody. If you want to cite those passages, do so quickly and very strategically. Because if you're going outside the passage and it doesn't point back to what you're trying to point you're pushing, it's just an ornament that's a distraction.
Yeah.
Cool?
Yeah.
Are we going twice?
Yeah.
Ooh-wee.
So on a longer passage and a complex passage, you need to be extra simple. So push yourself to not dumb it down like we're idiots, but just make it as simple as humanly possible, especially around the points, the sub-points. If you can try to morph them where there's a consistent rhythm throughout, and the language is cleaned up. Like I think your last point was the arc of salvation of suffering, is that right?
Oh, it was like a sub-point.
Sub-point, yeah. So, I mean, that's sort of proving my point that even sub-points should just be super, super simple, especially in challenging texts.
I thought one thing that would have been helpful as a listener would have just been an illustration to hang some of these things on, or just more creative ways to just visually engage us, analogy or something.
Like an interpretive dance?
Yes.
Yeah. You can call him Sue.
Some sort of interpretive.
He's always ready for a spontaneous dance.
I think just maybe a couple things just to hang some of this.
Right.
I mean, you were laying, like Jeremy said, some of this theology and like some big phrases
Right.
and words, just something that gives it some structure for us or a picture to understand interaction. Could help.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good point.
Yeah, I'm probably gonna say something kind of similar to what's already been said as my second one, which is that you've got a long passage. It's complex. There's a lot going on. You're hearing from guys that you're doing a lot of different stuff out there. And maybe one of the things that would have helped is if you had been able to spend more time with each of those sections and try to just distill what's the main point of this subsection. Let me get one sentence, one pithy, this is it. Because then we don't get lost
Right.
in the forest for all the trees that you're pointing out. Then all those trees, and you don't even have to point them all out now.
Yeah.
But the few that you do point out really serve to drive home that very clearly articulated idea in that section.
Right.
It will also help you as you try to figure out, well, how do I transition from this section to that section?
Mm-hmm.
So less is more with the bigger passage.
Another thing that could have helped us there was just thinking through how to apply your message to pastors.
Yeah.
So I thought you tried, but it wasn't, I couldn't say it was a sermon for
Concrete.
ministers. Yeah, gospel ministers. It sounded more church in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would say that one of the things that you could definitely work on, this happened a couple of times, is where you would read a text and then you would say something. And it wasn't clear why you were reading it, particularly when you're rereading the passage. Always, if you're going to read something, tell people why you're going to read it and then go to it. Instead of like, I'm going to read it, now I'm going to tell you, because they're not going to pay attention to the reading. I guarantee you.
Right.
I know that for a fact because I never pay attention. And everybody I was preached to when I used to do that didn't pay attention. So then they're kind of like, wait, what was he talking about? Instead of being like, here's the thing I want to say. Like, here's kind of like what I'm arguing right here in this moment. See, it's right here in the passage. And that way you actually have to read a lot less. Because you were reading a lot of it again. Just in your passage even.
Right.
And it wasn't like, it was like you were reading like 4 verses to really say like this one small thing. Because you want to kind of lead up to it.
Right.
When if you say a thing, you say, see, it's right there in verse 12.
So then if I go through the points, I do not need to read the whole thing.
Heck no. No, yeah, so I think that in general, this gets like Michael's point. And, you know, I think some of us in here have struggled with this term so far, is expositional preaching is not explaining every verse. Right? That is the lie of expository preaching.
Yeah.
That is not preaching at all. It's giving, at best, an exegetical lecture. So, because you had like, this gets to like, not only Michael's point, but then also Eric's point. Like, it felt like you had, yes, 3 homiletical points, but really you had about 9 points, which were really 9 verse sections that you were kind of explaining as you went along. So it felt jumbled in there. Whereas if you just had like that point and like this thing you're trying to argue to, and everything you're saying in the passage is what actually makes that point. So that's, you studied the passage, right? Now you get to declare it. We're going to talk a lot more about that next term.
Along the same lines as what everybody's been saying, even jumping around in the text of your text, you went back to 12 quite a bit at the end, like over and over again. Maybe making a point of why you're going to go back to 12 and then go back to it for one reason instead of over and over and over again will just be helpful, because then I'm like, oh, I'm at 12. No, I'm not. Where am I now? Oh, now I'm back at 12. No, I'm not. But yeah, it'll just be helpful for your hearers so that they can focus in why you went back to that one section.
Yeah, the other thing I just put, I think was already mentioned, was just the application. Obviously, there's the suffering and responding to suffering, not wasting it. But other than that, applying it, obviously it's a tough passage.
And just my last thing is just a tip more than it is a critique, is make sure you work your way down the worksheet. The reason why all of the critiques are rooted in the lapse in structure, or like your own confession was, I struggled with the structure. And so since that structure reveals the aim,
Right.
you know, the whole thing we just went through in a small group, I think that was where some time could have been spent to make sure that you're clear about what Peter is getting after in this passage in one sentence. What would you say is something that you felt good about? Good things.
I really like, even though it's a little bumpy, the structure, but I really like how this finished. Because my point was like, hey, look, this is horizontal and vertical, and then horizontal, and then the point that intersects is a cross, and I'm like, oh, This is
Can
really
you
cool.
see it?
Yeah, can you see it?
Can you see it?
Yes, sir.
So not that is the intention of Peter, but it's helpful to be memorable for people. So, yeah.
Yeah. So this might sound like a throwaway comment, but it's not. You read the Bible really well. And that communicates so much about you as a preacher and what you believe about the Bible, what you believe about this text. And I was almost more engaged, which isn't it's a good thing. I was almost more engaged when you were reading the Bible than I was when you were preaching, because you were animated by it. It was like, this thing is alive to me as you read it. So that was really good. Keep doing that.
Josue, I appreciated just how you marched through literally the entire text. I know we talked about it's expository preaching isn't just explaining, but like you were not, except for verse 19, obviously, you marched through. To your credit, like you were going to every corner of each section, and I appreciated that. Just your willingness in a large passage like this to do that.
Next week he's doing a message just on 19.
I'm signing up for that.
See you next week.
Purgatory, the Christian's hope.
I want to go back to where I started. I really do want to go back to your last sentence. The conclusion is what you leave people with, and the last sentence of your conclusion is the last thing you leave them with. And if you think about a conclusion as a wedge that's holding the entire weight of the sermon above it, you know, I want it to come to this point that's just landing on people, right? And I think that's what your last sentence did. If people were a bit lost along the way, like I was, or you know, distracted by all the trees for the forest, your last sentence brought it home for me. And that's what last sentences should always do, I think.
Yep.
Thank you.
I appreciated your structure as well. I thought you were quite clever in the way, the strategies you're employing. Now granted, we could have just worked on the clarity of each one. But when you got to that last one, you're connecting with vertical and horizontal. I was like, oh man, that's good. And you weren't saying that, you see?
Can you see it?
But it was just briefly moving on and just showing us. And then you spoke about the sufferings of Christ in that point. So that was a helpful, given all we've said about being clear, there's some clarity there.
Yeah, I think one of my things I thought you did well is you decided to go under fire your first time preaching here in not your first language, right? And I thought that for preaching in English, in this context, which has got to be intimidating, I thought you did an excellent job at just getting up there and preaching. You didn't apologize. You didn't kind of, woe is me. You just like went for it, and it was clear that you were like, I'm here to preach the Bible, and I'm going to do it, which was great.
You gave motivations why we should suffer, and I thought those were incredibly helpful for our Lord and for Christ. I just think it's nice to not just say for someone to do something, but to make clear the reason why they should. So.
Yeah, I enjoyed something you said earlier of not worth suffering for doing good with no fear of the Lord. You know, because or else you're just getting mistreated. There's no purpose in it. As opposed for us Christians, this is an act of worship, a trust, and the blessing comes later.
Yeah, man. You had some killer one-liners, man. Early on, like these questions were just grabbing. So you want to keep these. What are you doing with your suffering? Do not waste your suffering. Those were really impactful statements that I think we call them tweetables. So they're short, they're catchy. People remember them, and they can walk. You know, it's easy to carry when you leave. So You want to keep those, yeah.
So this is somewhat related to Jeremy's comment, but that joke that you had at the beginning was fantastic. Not only because it was funny, and it was like, I like funny things, but especially in a context like this and at a preacher's conference, you gotta prove your ethos right away. And what that joke did is it communicated, oh, Josue's comfortable. He's ready. He's funny. Someone who cracks a joke up there is comfortable enough to be preaching. And it's like, all right, I'm ready. And I was ready to listen to everything you had to say after that. So it was like, it was a good move to help us jump in.
I mean, he's gonna bomb his next intro to the sermon. He's gonna come with a great joke and he's gonna crash and burn.
This guy's gonna have like 10 jokes next
He's gonna have 5 minutes of solid.
19
Yeah.
one-liners.
Open mic at the pastor's conference.
Thank you for the feedback. Josue, I give you a lot of props for getting up there, going under fire, getting after it. I appreciate it. Thank you for bringing us the word, brother. And I specifically a small little point, but just your quick points on baptism in this text, how it aids what we're seeing, how he connects it with resurrection. It was like the way you addressed it, handled it, and you weren't like overblown by it and going into some long thing on baptism. I just thought it was well done, and yet also like educational, in that you're saying it's a public testimony of faith, just quick teaching points. Here's baptism, here's how it's being used. I'm not getting derailed by it. I thought that was well done.
I want to affirm your instinct to go back and deal with Psalm 34. Now we could quibble about how much time you spent there, et cetera, but your decision to go back and understand what's going on in Psalm 34 and how it's functioning here in light of what's going on there is exactly the right instinct.
Yeah.
Because it's the ground for what he's saying there at the beginning.
Yes, sir.
So, good decision.
Pay attention to that inform word right there.
So I also think there's a way of speaking about suffering that belittles people's suffering. And the way you came across was you could have been more pointed in your pastoral application, but you were pastoral. You didn't show a sense of callousness about the suffering we endure. You said this is serious, and that came across in your tone. So keep doing that, man. That was good.
Yeah, I would say that, and this is the other side of the coin of my critique about the theological comments that were dropped throughout. You clearly are a fan of and know a lot of systematic theology. And I think that it was clear that, if he gets a handle on how to wield this well in preaching, it'll be effective. So it's like all the pieces were there. You just got to kind of figure out which ones don't belong, right? And then also how to order the ones that are there. But it was clear that, once he gets a handle on this, it's going to go somewhere.
So you can be good, is what he's saying.
That's right.
But that's what he says to almost everybody.
Right.
Eric's never heard it. But
You have a chance. So you gave a lot of challenging things like Sid was saying about don't complain, take advantage. We all like the living part, but we don't like the dying part. So I thought those were very thought-provoking and very helpful.
Readables, man.
Yeah, so.
When you talked about suffering as a way to proclaim Christ, and just using that quick, just story of the apostles in Acts, that was such a good visual representation of that, and that resonate with us well, and you're here as well. It's like, okay, this is a way that I can actually apply this and use it to proclaim Christ.
So this is a compliment with a critique coat on it. So although you read quite a bit, you were very deliberate to come off the paper to challenging the course is time for preparation and familiarizing yourself with the passage and the sermon. You might not always have time. But in the moment of preaching, eye contact is critical, especially in a setting this small. So although you read quite a bit, you came off that paper and you looked me in my eyes. And that's powerful when speaking to a small group. So, well done.
There it is.
Man, you did this thing today.